Hello, everyone. My name is Maggie Flanigan. I'm the director of the AFA Visual Arts program at Caldwell Community College and Technical Institute. And today I'm going to do a quick cell phone photography lesson for the Mitford Museum. And this one is best suited for people around the ages of 8 to 15 years old. I'm going to give you some time as we go through to pause this video and try to practice what you're learning. I find for myself and for most of my students that we learn best by doing as opposed to just sitting and listening. So I highly encourage you to take those breaks and try out what you're learning before getting all the way to the end of this video. The first thing that I want to go over is just a brief understanding of what's actually happening inside of your camera. Obviously, these things would be a little bit more helpful if you had a big, large camera where you can change all of these settings. So I won't go super into depth here, but just to give you a basic idea, there are three elements that go into making a photograph. They all relate to how light enters your camera, and they each sort of have a side effect. So we usually talk about this in terms of the exposure triangle, showing that there are three different elements that all make up how light comes into the camera that you're using. And this is happening in your cell phone as well, just with a little bit less ability to change it from its automatic settings. The first example here of the one of the sides of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. The side effect here is blurring and stopping motion. So your slide says the shutter speed is the amount of time the camera's shutter remains open when taking a photo and controls the amount of time that we capture light for and allows us to freeze or blur motion. As our cell phones have gotten better, we do actually have some of these settings in many cell phone cameras now where you can use a night vision mode and go up to a 10-second long exposure. So you could play around with this by going into a room that's a little bit darker and trying to let that camera shutter be open for a full 10 seconds. And what you'll see is that motion around you tends to get a little bit blurrier as the lens is open for longer. This is just another example of what that looks like. It's a pinwheel. If you're using a really fast shutter, you're going to be able to stop the motion, even if it's moving. And if you're using a slow shutter speed, you're going to get this blur. Neither of these things are right or wrong or good or bad. They're just ways to make a certain effect happen. And you could have a reason for any of the effects mentioned. This is a very famous photographer named Harold Edgerton, and he's an example of using shutter speed in a really unique way. And what he's actually doing is leaving his camera shutter open for a long time and flashing light at it so that we get this tennis racket moving in succession. Here's an example from a student. So they're able to blur the motion of the 1 foot by taking a photograph with a longer shutter speed, keeping 1 foot still, and moving the other foot. So you have both stillness and motion in the same image. The next element on that triangle is called aperture. Aperture, I'll move myself off of this slide so you can see. Aperture is in a mechanical sense refers to the size of the opening at the back of the lens, which controls how much light is being passed into the camera sensor. Aperture is often also called f-stop, and it's important to the exposure of your photograph. But it also affects how much of your image is in focus or the depth of field. This is another photography term. It's an important stylistic choice and impacts the look and feel of your image. Most cell phone cameras do not have the ability to have true aperture. Their aperture is set and cannot be changed. What you can mimic is by using anything in the sort of portrait mode settings in your camera. This is not real aperture. It's a digital filter that kind of tries to guess what the background is and blurs it out. But it'll give you a similar feeling and a similar effect in your cell phone. Here's an example of what that looks like. Those are those f-stops. So f1.8 is a really shallow depth of field, meaning most of the image is blurry and only some of it is in focus. And those things are going up all the way to f22, where almost the entirety of the image is in focus at once. Here's an example of a shallow depth of field image by Daniel Seth Krauss, and he is using the background blur for aesthetics in this image. So again, not right or wrong, just a choice to make. Here's an example from students at the community college. So in the background of the image on the left, all those bricks are in focus, and in the image on the right, we've blurred those out for an aesthetic choice. So we have a shallow depth of field and a deep depth of field. Same thing here for this student example. What I love about this example is the image on the left kind of tells us what we should be looking at, and the image on the right gets visually confusing because that piece that's being held looks almost identical to all of the floral life in the background. And so it's confusing for the eye and maybe not the best choice for this particular image. ISO is the last thing on that triangle. It is a camera setting that allows you to introduce more light into the scene, creating brighter images. At the same time, ISO affects the amount of grain or noise in the image. People sometimes say grain, sometimes say noise. And you may have seen it in a picture before where it almost looks like you can see pixels or like dots all over your image. So the higher your ISO, the more of those dots you'll see, but you're able to make images in lower lighting. All of this is coming from the language of film speeds back when we put film into cameras, and you can still buy film in specific speeds. And so you would buy a roll of film that comes in ISO 400 or 800 or so on and so forth. This is an example of a very low light image by photographer M. White. And this one is kind of the opposite of that. So very bright light by Woodling Cadet. So you're trying to decide which ISO to use depending on how much light is already available to you in the world. So if you're outside, you would need a different ISO than if you're inside, and all of those in-betweens would also require different ISOs. This is also something you're not going to be able to actually change in a cell phone, but I want you to know it exists out there if you decide to continue this photo journey. This brings us into the elements of photographic composition, and this is where you're going to start your own work today in this class, this digital class. So the things we're talking about are composition, which composition is just the arrangement of visual elements within a photograph. It's how photographers organize a scene to create meaning, guide the viewer's eyes, and strengthen the image. And in photography, we talk about this thing called the non-blank canvas. And unlike painting or drawing, photographers begin with a world that already exists. Rather than creating every element, photographers compose by choosing where to stand, what to include, what to exclude, and when to press the shutter. Every framing decision shapes how the viewer experiences the photograph. The first rule that we're looking at is called the rule of thirds. This says that if you divide the frame into 9 equal sections using 2 horizontal and 2 vertical lines, you're going to be placing your key subjects along those lines or at the intersections, and this will create a strong balance, strong emphasis, and strong visual interest. So what we're looking at here, this is just a grid that I overlaid onto this photograph to show you how the subject kind of meets in the middle of one of those intersections, and their eye meets at almost a cross section there. You can turn this rule of thirds grid on in your cell phone if you want to see it while you're composing your images out in the world. These are some more examples of what that rule of thirds might look like, so that in this case, the photograph is up in that top third of the image and the bed is in that bottom third of the image. I love this photograph by Daniel Coburn where they've taken magazine eyes and placed it on this dad's face, and his face and those eyeballs are meeting right at an intersection of that rule of thirds here. This Susan Worsham image of a child at a window, they're almost using the window itself as a frame that kind of plays along those lines of the rule of thirds. This is an example that a student made, and it's a very literal one. So if you're kind of struggling where to get started, just think about this in literal 3 chunks or 3 sections, and that'll get you started seeing what we're talking about with this rule. The next element is patterns. Pattern is the repetition of visual elements such as shapes, colors, textures, or objects. Repeating elements can create rhythm, emphasize order, or draw the viewer's eye through the image. So in this example, that's my example, there's all these leaves on the roof of this building, and each of those shapes is so similar to each other that they kind of start to create a pattern in the image. This Daniel Seth Krauss image is of a stained glass window in a church being reflected in a TV screen. She's kind of like hunting in the world for patterns, which oftentimes that's what we do as photographers. We kind of hunt out the compositions and the elements that we're looking for. It's almost like a scavenger hunt today. Here's another example where he's thinking about the pattern as that vacuum line in the carpet, which you've probably seen in your houses when someone is vacuuming. Maybe it's you that's vacuuming. Keisha Scarville has a whole series of these images that are called Mama's Clothes, where she photographed herself interacting with clothing that was left by her mother. And she turns all of these images black and white so that we focus on just the patterns. So that could be a way to think about how to approach this element is by, in your camera, in your phone, changing the image to a black and white image to begin with. Hagen Pearson's soda cans is another example of patterns. Same here with Daniel Coburn's. What I love in this image is we have the balls flying through the air, and we also have the shadows being cast on the wall. And all of those spherical shapes are creating a sense of pattern across the image. Here's an example from a student. So they were able to find this pattern as a shadow cast on the ground underneath some chairs and tables. Similar thing here, light passing through objects, creating a similar pattern. They're also using that strategy of making the image black and white in both of these examples. The next one is texture, and texture refers to the visual quality of a surface as seen through variations in detail, shape, tone, and color. In photography, texture can create depth, emphasize material qualities, and make a two-dimensional image feel more tactile. So this is the surface of water with little water bugs on it, and it feels very smooth and soft in the way that the texture is being visually represented. This is an example by Joshua White. This is a tintype showing a really kind of rough texture in the image. It's almost exclusively texture in this image. Another example here where the child's pajamas and their blanket are the same and they all kind of feel soft, like you could hug them, and gives us a lot of visual texture across the entire image. This Nadia Sablin piece, it's almost doubled down the softness of the texture by adding in the hands in the image where it feels like this person is showing you just how soft this fur might feel to the touch. Some examples from students, this kind of rough tiles, sort of like concrete tiles stacked up. A rough burlap here as a texture example. So this is where you can pause the video and take, as long as it needs, I would recommend something like 15 minutes, and take your cell phone and go out and try to find each of these elements that we've described so far. So you've got the rule of thirds, pattern, and texture. See if you can make an image that really represents each of them. And as you'll see as we go along, sometimes you'll make an image that represents all of them in one image. So you could try to get that as well. So pause it here if you want to take those 15 minutes and make your images. Once you've finished with that, you can come back and we'll do the next chunk of elements. And the next one is symmetry. So symmetry occurs when elements on either side of an axis mirror one another. In photography, symmetrical compositions create balance, harmony, and a sense of order within the frame. So in this case, it's almost the opposite of the rule of thirds, right? Where we're setting something off to the side to create a dynamic composition. In symmetry, we're putting it right in the middle on purpose. And so just like you saw with all of those elements of the triangle, the exposure triangle, that there's no right or wrong, there's just a reason why and when to do something. That's the same thing here. Sometimes it makes sense to have a symmetrical image, sometimes it makes sense not to. This is an Elizabeth McGrady image where she's directly in the center of this frame, and even the background sort of dips to her. So if we folded this image in half, it would be almost a perfect mirror on either side. Another example, Keith Carter image that's almost perfectly symmetrical. I mean, it is symmetrical. It's not in a radial sense, but in this splitting it down the middle sense, it is. Here's an example from a student. So this is almost like a hack or a fun way to play with it. They're using a mirror to make a perfect symmetry. So you could find a mirror in your house and kind of play along with this and see if you can make an image have perfect symmetry. Here's an example where the subject is simply directly in the middle of the frame, which also would represent symmetry. Now, asymmetry is the opposite of that, right? So asymmetry occurs when elements in a composition are not mirrored or evenly distributed, and photographers use asymmetry to create tension, movement, and visual interest while still maintaining balance within the frame. So here we've got this dog set off to the side a little bit. Most of the top of the frame is really light and the bottom chunk is much darker. And so it's creating a sense of interest in the opposite of symmetry. Here's some examples of other photographers using asymmetry to create interest and intrigue in an image. So this would be a symmetrical image if there was only that back figure, but since there's a person in the foreground or in the front of the frame, we're going to see it as a more asymmetrical image. An example from Patricia Swanson, where this bug is down on the right corner of the image, feeling like a much heavier weight of the photograph is all on one side of the image. Here's an example from a student. So this almost makes the car feel like it's stuck because they used asymmetry. It feels like it shouldn't be there. So that's a great way to create that tension. This is an example where they're using glasses to kind of throw the perspective. This one's also a good example of that shallow depth of field that we talked about. So we'll start to see these images represent multiple versions of what we're talking about here. The next image is for light. Light is the foundation of photography. The camera captures how light interacts with the subject. By adjusting the position and quality of natural or artificial light, photographers can dramatically alter the mood, form, texture, and meaning of an image. So this is a very literal example that I made in a film camera where light entered into the film where it wasn't supposed to. So it kind of pours over the frame and makes the whole image feel extremely bright. This is a Gregory Crewdson image. So what we're seeing here is that artificial light example where they're creating flashlights coming in from holes in the ground so that it feels like this person is experiencing something supernatural. In this case, this artist, Elizabeth McGrady, is using natural light to create this sense of feeling. So it feels sort of soft as the light pours over her or over the plants outside. Similar thing here with Ashley Kausinger, placing her mother by the window gives her a really light sense of softness as well. Here's some examples from students. So if it's really bright outside, you'll have a much easier time finding these light examples, or if you can find light pouring in through a window or a lamp in your house, you could really play around with this element. Another great student example, capturing out in the sun. So again, you're going to pause this video so that you don't forget how many elements there are and take the next chunk. So 15 minutes, you're going to make a photograph that represents symmetry, one that represents asymmetry, and one that represents light. Once you've come back from that, we've got a couple more to go. The next one is lines, and lines are just visual pathways that organize a photograph and influence how the viewer moves through the image. By using natural or created lines, photographers can lead attention towards a subject, create depth, or suggest movement and emotion. So here's an example by Shauna Caldwell where these images are meant to be seen together, and we have skinny lines in one image and these much thicker broad lines in the other image. Here's a student example where they're using light from the last chunk, and that light itself is creating these lines that make a dynamic composition across the frame. Same thing here, using light as a sense of a line. So you don't have to find literal lines in the world, but you could create them through light and dark and contrast. Speaking of contrast, that's our next element. Contrast occurs when opposing elements are placed together within an image. Strong differences in light, color, texture, or subject matter can create depth, emphasize a focal point, and shape the mood of a photograph. Here's a Latoya Ruby Frazier image that has that sense of contrast, having a lighter skinned hand and a darker skinned hand coming together and holding hands. Patricia Swanson again with a very bright mug here in the foreground, much darker elements in the background of her image. This is a double exposure, which you could also do in your phone. There's many apps you can use to make that happen. Here's an example from a student creating this dark and light together in a very intense sort of contrast here. So you think about getting really up close on something like this example so that you can find just the contrast that you're looking for. Another contrast example, so not using a really bright day helps with this one. This one's, you've got a little bit of light coming in through the window, and the rest of this classroom is completely dark, giving us a true contrast here. One more example from a student finding something that already has contrast, like a black and white article of clothing or pair of shoes. Color is your next element, and color is the element of art created by light and defined by hue, value, and saturation. In photography, color shapes mood, directs attention, creates contrast, and communicates meaning. Photographers can emphasize or alter color through lighting, white balance, camera settings, and post-processing to influence how an image is experienced. Here's a Woodland cadet image. So you could think about even setting up a photograph like this, where they're going out into the world, setting up this backdrop, finding people, having them wear an outfit that all kind of matches together. So you could go through your house and find every object that's blue and make a composition and photograph that. Evelyn Bensakova is another example of that, where she's using really limited color palettes to make her images feel a specific emotion. And Mary Ellen Bartley is limiting her color palette by having almost exclusively white in her images. She's able to create a really strong and striking composition by taking all of the color out. Heather Evans Smith is doing a similar thing by making her images primarily blue, and she even has a whole photographic series where every image is primarily blue. So again, you're going to take 15 minutes to make a photograph that represents each of the elements we just learned about, which is lines, contrast, and color. And when you're finished with that, you can come back for the last section. The last section deals with perspective. And this means that where you are in relation to your subject shapes the image. Subjects that are photographed from above have a different impact than those that are photographed from below. So we call this in photography a bird's eye view, and a bird's eye view places the camera above the subject and from this elevated perspective, and from an elevated perspective, excuse me. This angle can make a subject appear smaller or more vulnerable. It can create a sense of separation or position the viewer as an observer looking into the scene, almost like a voyeur. That's a fancy word for looking in at a scene that you maybe aren't participating in. This is a really slight example of that by Joshua White. So he's just slightly above this couple in the lake. So it doesn't have to be dramatic to still be a bird's eye perspective. And this example is an extreme example where they're probably either on a bridge even higher than this, or maybe even in a helicopter or an airplane. So you could get as high as you can imagine climbing up on a ladder or from the second story of your house to create a really extreme bird's eye perspective here. Here's an example that's, again, that sort of subtlety, the softness that makes the person in the image feel more vulnerable because we are looking down at them as the viewer of the image. Here's an example from a student where they're getting above their subject on this rock and a rock climbing space and photographing them from above. Your worm's eye view is the opposite here. So like symmetry has an opposite of asymmetry. Bird's eye has an opposite of worm's eye. And a worm's eye view in photography is a photograph that has a subject that we're looking at from below. So we're looking upward. This perspective exaggerates size and scale and often makes the subjects appear powerful or monumental or imposing while placing the viewer in a more vulnerable position. Sometimes it could feel like you're giving honor to the person or the subject that is above you in an image. Sometimes it also makes the person in the image feel judgmental. So this image makes me feel like this woman's like looking down at me or scolding me. And Daniel Coburn is doing that by being slightly beneath her. Again, it's kind of a subtle version of it. Similar thing with Delmar Gamaro's image, where this man is looking kind of down his nose at us, making him feel more powerful than us. Stella Blackman's image, you could have someone climb up into a tree or climb up into a ladder and photograph them from below to give them a sense of power there. Here's some examples from students. So a kind of easy way to do this is to lay down on the ground so that you feel like a literal worm on the ground and you're photographing everything in the world from above you. It also makes you feel small as the viewer. So in this example, there's no people in it, but because we're down on the ground, it makes the leaves and trees feel enormous. So it makes us feel really small. Another example from a student here. And then eye level is the next one. And an eye level view photographs a subject from the same height as the viewer's perspective. It's a familiar viewpoint, which creates a sense of connection, equality, and presence, allowing viewers to engage with the subject more directly. And in this Susan Worsham example, it doesn't mean that you just stay at the height that you are. It means getting to the eye level of your subject. So if you're taller than these children laying on the bed, then you need to squat down so that your camera lens is at the exact same height as the eyes of the subject that you're photographing. An example from Nadia Sablin here, giving her auntie some power by photographing her at the exact same level. It also makes us feel more connected, like we're staring right into her eyes, which is something we don't get to do with people in the world all that often. Joshua White example here, getting down onto the ground to make sure that this woman is more at an eye level than what you would normally experience. Here's an example from a student. So you could try this with a friend or a family member and have them squat down or have you climb up onto a chair so that you can make your eyes match their eyes when you take a photograph of them. So then in this case, you're going to take 15 more minutes and try to make a photograph for each of the perspectives that we've just learned about, which would be bird's eye view, worm's eye view, and eye level. And that's all that I have for you in this lesson today. This is some contact information for me, so you can go to my website or to my Instagram and see more of my images or reach out to me and share with me the images that you've made after watching this video. I hope that this helps you to find new perspectives and new ways to make photographs and to just enjoy yourself out there making photos. Have a great day.